All right, so this one's pretty exciting for us today. It's not only a new bike, but it's a new brand that we'll be carrying at the shop. Today we've got the GT Sensor. So the Sensor falls in the trail category for GT. It's got 140 millimeters of rear wheel travel, it's got 150 millimeters up front, and it's got some fairly moderate geometry. And there is a bit of a theme to this bike. It's very, very simple. It doesn't have a lot of the bells and whistles that we're used to seeing on some bikes these days, but that does not mean it performs poorly. In fact, it's very much the opposite. So stick around to see how it does. All right, so let's cover a couple of high-level details before we go out and ride this thing. The GT Sensor looks simple, and it is. It lacks a lot of the modern features we're seeing on a lot of bikes, like flip chips, internal frame storage, internal tool storage, size-specific chainstays. But really, a lot of those things are niceties, not necessarily necessities. So none of them really end up being a deal breaker for me, especially because GT has nailed the fundamentals on this bike. They've nailed the geometry and the suspension. All right, so let's cover a couple of notes about the geometry and the suspension. Nothing too fancy here. We're using a tried and true 4-bar suspension design. And a lot of people seem to think that's an inferior design because it doesn't have a lot of moving parts and there's no patent on it anymore, but that's not necessarily the case, and the GT Sensor does a good job of busting that myth. It sure as hell works very well. So this bike uses 140 millimeters of rear travel and 150 up front with that RockShox Lyric fork. We've got two 29-inch wheels, a 65-degree head tube angle. We've actually got a very long 515 millimeter reach in my size XL, and I have a really hard time believing it's that big because it feels quite a bit smaller. I guess that could be a lot of that steep seat tube. It is 77 degrees, brings you up closer, making that seated reach number feel a little bit shorter. We also have 440 millimeter chainstays. That's across all sizes, but on my extra large, that ends up being a pretty decent size, not too short, not too long. I would imagine someone on a shorter frame might find them on the longer side, but still within reason. And it does have a 1289 millimeter wheelbase, which on a 140 mil trail bike is actually fairly long. And some of that stability does come through out on the trail. So let's get into it. All right, so the Sensor is one of those bikes that seems to completely disappear underneath you while you're riding it. I've actually noticed that about a lot of 140 mil travel bikes, which that's probably a story for a different day. But this bike disappears underneath you in a very good way. It doesn't call attention to itself. It doesn't distract from your riding. It just lets you go out and ride your bike. The Sensor does perfectly fine on the climbs. I wouldn't call it the sportiest or the liveliest climber. There are definitely faster climbers, zippier, more efficient, more sports car feeling, but the Sensor does a perfectly adequate job. And a lot of people are gonna hear that and think, oh man, this bike sucks. That's not the case at all. Adequate means it does the job just fine, and this does the job just fine. It is on the more active side of the spectrum, which does lend itself to a lot more traction and a lot more comfort and give out of the bike on the climbs, which is something that makes it a pretty good technical climber, while it might not be the fastest or the most efficient climber. So let's dive into that suspension design a little bit. Like we've talked about, it uses that 4-bar design, and it's not the snappiest or the fastest platform, but it does balance pedaling efficiency and traction really well. It reminds me quite a bit of the Santa Cruz Hightower. There's certainly some movement when you stand up and pedal. There is a little bit of bob, but I never felt it necessary to reach down and use the lockout. The benefit of that more active suspension, though, is traction. So that rear wheel sticks to almost anything as you pick your way up loose, steep, rocky, rooty, ledgy climbs. That rear wheel is going to stick to the ground. So that is what makes the Sensor a pretty good technical climber, is its ability to generate traction. And just for a point of reference, I ran mine at about 28 to 29% sag. That's kind of the sweet spot I honed in on. That gave me the right balance of efficiency and traction. So as for the Sensor's geometry, I don't really have anything to complain about here either. It's not the most extreme or the coolest or the sexiest geometry, but it's very usable and it sits in that more moderate range. I personally enjoyed the more upright feel that this bike offers. That front end feels pretty tall, and the bike does come with 30 mil rise bars. So as a tall, lanky guy, that's how I like my bikes, so I felt right at home. Other shorter riders or someone who prefers a sportier cockpit might want to adjust that, swap out that bar or something. The seat tube angle here worked wonders for keeping my weight balanced nicely between the wheels, and like I said, it made that long reach feel a little less long when I was seated on the bike. And those chainstays at 440 kind of fell in what we're seeing on most bikes these days. And for me, on my frame, they did feel on the shorter side, but not so short that I was falling off the back of the bike. I was plenty happy with them. And like I said earlier, that wheelbase ends up being a pretty long one for a 140 mil bike, which does make it a little less agile on those really tight hairpin switchbacks. It almost makes you feel like you're riding a bigger enduro bike on those corners rather than, 140 mil trail bike. So overall, there's really not a lot to disagree with on the Sensor on the climbs. It does everything that's asked of it without really complaining at all, strikes a nice balance between efficiency and traction and comfort and control. The best way to describe it is well balanced. So while the Sensor is a very competent climber, I think it's a better descender. It's quick, it's nimble, it corners like crazy, it's so freaking fun, and it's capable enough for almost any trail you'd want to go ride. So starting with that suspension design, it's simple, but damn, it works really well. It's smooth, active, plush, and maybe the best part about it is it's predictable and consistent throughout the entire stroke. There's nothing weird happening at any point. It feels well supported from the initial stroke all the way through to the end stroke. There were no weird spots where it felt too stiff or too soft where it blew through the travel. It ramps up as you'd expect at the end. It doesn't just kind of hit this squared off wall of progression. It ramps up into it. It just performs like how you'd want your bike to perform. There might be plusher bikes out there, there might be poppier bikes out there, there might be more progressive bikes out there, but I think you'd be hard pressed to find a bike that is as good at every point in that stroke as this bike is. So just like on the climbs, the Sensor provides a lot of traction on the downhill. I think that's half of the cornering equation for this bike. We'll get to the other half, the geometry, in just a second though. That suspension generating traction just helps you push into corners, helps you trust the bike in the corners, and it offers just enough stability that you're not getting bounced around or thrown offline too much. And it also offers a very lively character that makes pumping and jumping rewarding and fun. It's not just a waste of energy, but it also kind of provides a nice soft catch. It's pretty easy to bunny hop and unweight to get over trail obstacles. And if it sounds a bit like I'm gushing about this suspension design, it's because I am. It's simple, but it's actually very high on my list of favorite suspension platforms. So the geometry complements the suspension very well. It's also very well balanced and not too extreme in one direction or the other. It's fairly middle of the road and usable across a wide variety of terrain. It also offers a quick and lively ride character that really starts to shine in the corners. In fact, I've rarely enjoyed cornering on a bike as much as I have on the Sensor. Almost every corner, flat, bermed, whatever you want to call it, you can pump into it so hard and just send dirt and rocks and squirrels and all sorts of stuff flying off into the trees. It is so fun. I think the balance between the reach and the chainstay lengths makes it very easy to find yourself centered up on the bike so that you can just worry about leaning it over, staying off the brakes, and just ripping through the corner. So the head tube angle is steep enough to not lead to understeer, but it's not so steep that it's squirrely and you're oversteering in every corner. That 65-degree angle is pretty nice for a bike in this category. And the geometry ends up being aggressive enough for riding just about anything, but not so big and so burly or so long and slack that it requires you to be really aggressive. So if you just want to go ride cruiser blues and greens and have fun, it facilitates that as much as it does hitting some kind of hairy black diamond, double black diamond terrain. So overall, the most accurate description I can think of for how the Sensor descends is balanced. And maybe that's boring, but I like the way this bike just disappears and lets you ride. So let's do a couple of comparisons here, and this one's going to be a little tough for me because I haven't ridden too much in this category for quite a while, but two bikes that come to mind are the Santa Cruz Hightower and the Yeti SB140. They both have similar geometry, travel lengths, intended uses, so I'll do my best to compare to those two bikes. So starting with the SB140, that's one of those bikes that I would take just about anywhere on this planet. It's well-rounded and it's capable, and that's exactly how I've just described the Sensor. So I think these two bikes are actually very similar. If I had to do a big day and go pedal and climb a ton, I would probably grab the SB140. I think it's a little bit more efficient and just overall maybe climbs a little bit better. If I had a big day of descending on the docket though, I would grab the Sensor. It maybe isn't more capable, it might be by just a hair, but it's more fun to me to ride. It's more playful, it's more poppy, it's a little more fun to jump and corner on. So I would especially grab it if I was hitting jumps and flow and berms. So now talking about the Hightower, these two are gonna be even tougher to differentiate because I think they're even more similar. On the climbs, I don't know if I could tell you if one was better than the other. I think they're too similar. They're both kind of active, they both prioritize traction, but they both do well enough that you're not gonna be too sad about it climbing up a big mountain. I would say on the descents though, that the Hightower I think is the bit more capable descender. It just feels a little bit more rugged, it craves speed, and I think it's gonna be the one I would pick if I was riding mostly black to double black diamond terrain. But if I was riding mostly blues, maybe the occasional black diamond, I'd probably grab the Sensor because I think it's the more fun and lively descender out of the two. So who is the Sensor for? This is one of those bikes that's tough to not just recommend to everyone. I will try to break it down a little bit better than that though. I particularly think this is good for new riders for a couple of reasons. First is the price point. We don't normally talk about that, but GT does offer pretty good bang for your buck. The thing I like about it the most for a new rider though is that it isn't too much of a one-trick pony. It kind of covers a wide range of riding, and newer riders maybe haven't found their niche just yet, so the Sensor is going to let them ride and figure out what they want to ride and how they like to ride. On the other hand though, I think more advanced riders are going to like it as well because again, it disappears underneath you and it lets you focus on riding, your cornering technique, jumping, finding fun, creative lines, and it doesn't get in the way of any of that. So someone who wants to work on their skill and wants to become better at biking might enjoy this bike because the bike maybe does a little bit less for you, or it doesn't really call attention to itself while you're trying to improve your skills. Really though, if you like riding bikes, I have a feeling you're probably gonna like riding the Sensor. It is very simple, but it has nailed the fundamentals. So bottom line for the Sensor, I keep coming back to it, and it's keep it simple, stupid. There's a lot of wisdom in that saying, and I think the Sensor embodies it very well. So thanks for sticking around. We'll see you next time.